I need you to understand something before we continue. Everything I'm about to tell you connects to documented facts, official records, and scientific data that anyone can verify. What wasn't official was the way this information was organized for me that night. Because isolated facts don't scare anyone. What scares people is when they finally make sense together. Area 51 exists. That's not a theory. The United States government officially acknowledged its existence in 2013 after decades of denial. What few people notice is that, while they acknowledge the base, they never explain the real purpose of several underground structures that appear in satellite imagery since the 1960s. Some of them simply don't match aircraft testing. I was a special operations operator. That's not unusual. People with my profile are used to secure sensitive facilities. What isn't common is the kind of information I received inside, not as theory, but as a correlation of historical data that had existed for decades and was always treated as coincidence. For example, science recognizes that the human species went through a severe genetic bottleneck about 70,000 years ago. That's a fact. Studies show the human population may have been reduced to only a few thousand individuals. What's never explained convincingly is how, after that, the human brain underwent an abrupt acceleration in complexity without a clear evolutionary pressure that would justify such a leap. Another fact, all major ancient civilizations share almost identical myths about beings who came down, taught agriculture, mathematics, writing, and laws, and then disappeared. This isn't belief. It's comparative archaeological record. Sumer, Egypt, Mesoamerica, the Indus Valley. Different narratives, identical structure. Inside Area 51, those data points weren't treated as mythology. They were treated as a recurring pattern. And patterns in military and scientific environments aren't ignored. They're investigated. What was presented to me in that room wasn't a being saying, "Believe me." It was a brutal correlation between neuroscience, anthropology, genetics, and human history. It was the observation that the human brain shows specific, measurable, consistent limitations, especially related perception of time, identity, and deep memory. Limitations that don't appear in other species in the same way. The entity, whatever was, didn't say it created humans. That would have been too simple. It said something much harder to accept. It said humanity functions like an old operating system running on hardware capable of far more, but deliberately restricted by layers of cognitive control. That echoes modern neuroscience directly. A large portion of brain processing is inaccessible to conscious awareness. When I heard that, I wanted to dismiss it as delusion. The problem is that everything that came after was supported by data I already knew, but had never connected. Real experiments on repressed memory. Real studies on fragmented perception of reality. Real historical records of systematic cultural erasures. If you keep going to the end, I'm not going to ask you to believe in entities, aliens, or easy conspiracies. I'm going to show you why science itself admits we don't know why we're conscious the way we are, why that ignorance is treated as normal, and why, according to what was presented to me, this is a failure of humanity, but a condition imposed long before any modern government existed. And that's when I understood the question was never, is this real or not? The question is why, even with so much data scattered in plain sight, almost no one can put the pieces together without help. When I walked out of that room for the first time, nothing seemed different. No alarms, no immediate interrogation, no feeling of a big reveal. And that was what disturbed me most. In military environments, when something truly important happens, you feel the weight immediately. But there, routine continued. People walked the corridors. Shifts rolled on. Protocols were followed, as if that information had already been integrated into how the place functioned. Only later, when I cross-checked the data I already knew, did I start to understand what was behind it. The first thing that came to mind was something I'd learned years earlier, outside any conspiratorial context. The human genetic bottleneck. That's accepted science. Population genetics research shows that at some point between 70 and 50,000 years ago, the human population dropped drastically. Some models suggest only a few thousand individuals remained. An entire species nearly vanished. What has never been explained satisfactorily is what came next. In evolutionary terms, deep changes take hundreds of thousands of years. But soon after that bottleneck, we see a strange cognitive leap. Complex symbolic language, cave art, burial rituals, abstract thought. All of this emerges in an extremely short window. There's no scientific consensus on the exact trigger. There are hypotheses, but no definitive conclusion. Inside the facility, that wasn't treated as an academic mystery. It was treated as a statistical anomaly. And anomalies in any technical field suggest interference, not chance. Another point presented to me wasn't secret, just rarely connected. Modern neuroscience recognizes that most human brain processing happens outside consciousness. Over 90%. That's not speculation. It's measurable. We make decisions before we become aware of them. We build narratives after the fact. The sensation of free will arrives as a late explanation, not as the cause. When you combine that with the fact that human memory is extremely malleable, subject to false memories, erasures, constant reconstruction, an uncomfortable question appears. Why is such an advanced biological system, at the same time, so unstable in the very things that define identity and continuity? That night, what I was told is that this instability isn't an emergent defect. It's a functional feature, a mechanism that prevents continuous access to certain layers of information. That echoes real research on dissociation, psychogenic amnesia, and compartmentalization of memory, phenomena even used in military training and psychological testing. Another impossible-to-ignore element is the historical pattern of erasure. Advanced civilizations rise, reach a peak of organization and knowledge, then collapse, leaving enormous gaps. The Library of Alexandria isn't a myth. Texts have been burned repeatedly across history. Records destroyed, knowledge streams interrupted, cultural transmission lines broken. Officially, this is blamed on war, politics, or religion. The pattern, however, is too consistent to be treated as mere coincidence. Inside Area 51, those events weren't seen as isolated tragedies. They were seen as partial resets, not in some mystical invisible hand sense, but as a predictable consequence of a species carrying knowledge beyond what it can sustain without social collapse. In that context, the entity made a statement that is still the hardest to accept, precisely because it doesn't contradict science. It said humans aren't ignorant because they fail to learn. They're ignorant because cognitive structure prioritizes survival, social cohesion, and simple narrative over total perception of reality. That would explain why complex ideas are constantly simplified into myths, why uncomfortable truths are emotionally rejected before they're rationally analyzed, and why entire societies can deny obvious facts when those facts threaten collective psychological structure. None of that requires belief in entities or external interventions. It's all documented in social psychology, neuroscience, and history. What changes is a combined interpretation. What changes is a final question. If these limitations are so clear, why are they never treated as a central problem of the human condition? When I questioned that, they told me something that still follows me, that the greatest risk to humanity was never extinction. It was full remembrance. Because remembering wouldn't only mean acquiring knowledge. It would mean realizing that much of what we call identity, progress, and choice is built on filters we never chose. And this is exactly where the story changes tone. Because from this point on, it wasn't about ancient data or historical patterns. It was about active programs, modern decisions, and why facilities like that still exist, officially acknowledged, but never fully explained. That's what comes next. After that initial explanation, there was an interval that was never officially recorded. No report, no recording, no time log. I only know I remained there long enough to notice what I still consider the most revealing point of everything. The conversation wasn't being conducted like an interrogation or a scientific presentation. It followed a specific rhythm, almost pedagogical, like that sequence of information had been tested many times before. That's when the discussion shifted from ancient patterns to modern data. Not distant history, not mythology, but contemporary statistics. The entity directed attention to something any serious researcher already admits, even uncomfortably: the global rise of anxiety disorders, depression, and dissociation in recent decades. That's not opinion. The numbers are public. Health organizations show consistent growth in these conditions, even in societies with more material comfort, broader access to information, and higher life expectancy. The common explanation is stress, overstimulation, modern life. What was presented to me was a different reading, based on the same data. The idea was simple and disturbing at the same time. The human brain evolved to handle limited, predictable, socially close environments. When exposed to massive volumes of information, multiple competing narratives, and a constant sense of abstract threat, it enters internal conflict, not out of weakness, but because it's operating outside the parameters it was tuned for. That explains why technological advancement hasn't brought proportional psychological stability. If anything, the opposite. The more information, the more internal fragmentation, the more apparent choices, the more paralysis. That's not speculation. Cognitive psychology has demonstrated the so-called choice paradox, where too many options reduce satisfaction and increase anxiety. What the entity did was scale that concept up to civilization level. It claimed humanity has entered a critical phase not because it's evolving too fast technologically, but because it's approaching the cognitive limit of collective processing, and that this limit always existed. The difference now is that we're hitting it simultaneously, globally, without adaptation intervals. Another dataset presented was the documented rise of mild dissociative phenomena in the general population. People report feelings of unreality, loss of connection to identity, lapses in subjective memory. Not extreme clinical cases, but subclinical levels that's recorded in studies, but treated as a side effect of modern life. There, it was described as a natural defense mechanism activating at scale. The entity explained that when a system can't integrate new information without collapsing, it fragments perception. That applies to individuals, groups, and entire species. It's not about going insane. It's about reducing the conscious field to preserve function. The result is a population capable of operating complex systems without fully understanding the context they're embedded in. That's when it said something that marked me deeply. It argued the greatest evidence humans are cognitively limited isn't what we fail to build, but the fact that we accept incomplete explanations as final, as long as they relieve psychological discomfort. Religion, ideology, political identity, simplified narratives. They work because they offer emotional closure, not because they deliver real understanding. None of this contradicts scientific data. If anything, it aligns with it. Social psychology shows humans prioritize belonging and internal coherence over factual accuracy. Research on cognitive bias, motivated reasoning, and cognitive dissonance is widely accepted. What changes is the interpretation. Instead of individual flaws, it was described as a collective architecture. When I asked why these things were being organized this way inside a military facility, the answer was direct. Because unlike academia, defense environments work with limits, risks, and extreme scenarios. If there's a point where a species can lose cohesion from too much consciousness, that point has to be mapped, monitored, and, if possible, slowed. Area 51, as suggested, doesn't exist only to test aircraft or exotic technologies. It functions as a correlation center, a place where data that doesn't fit into traditional departments gets analyzed together. Biology, psychology, history, artificial intelligence, collective behavior. Not to control individuals, but to understand how far the human system can go without disintegrating. That's when I realized the conversation wasn't a warning about the past. It was an assessment of the present, and maybe a preparation for something that hadn't happened yet. But the data already suggested was inevitable. Before I could ask another question, the entity ended that phase with a sentence that sounded more like a diagnosis than a threat. It said humanity is approaching the point where the old layers of cognitive containment are no longer sufficient. And when that happens, there's no return to the previous state. There's only adaptation or collapse. What comes after doesn't involve broad theories or historical patterns anymore. It involves specific decisions, modern projects, and why certain experiments are never publicly discussed, even when their results appear indirectly in everyday life. That's what I need to explain next. After that statement, there was no dramatic silence or theatrical ending. The room simply changed function. People entered as if it were just another shift. Tablets came online, panels lit up, and for the first time since I arrived in Section E, I saw data being projected. Not symbols, not abstract graphs meant to confuse. Numbers, curves, correlations, things any analyst would recognize. That's when it became clear the facility wasn't trying to discover something new. It was monitoring something already underway. The entity stopped speaking in broad terms and started pointing to verifiable trends: exponential growth of AI systems, rising cognitive automation, increasing reliance on algorithms for human decisions. This isn't a distant future. It's documented present. Platforms already shape choices, political behavior, consumption, attention, and even personal relationships. What I was told is that this didn't emerge by accident. When a species reaches a limit of conscious processing, it creates external extensions to compensate: tools, then machines, then systems that can filter the world for it. The entity called this cognitive outsourcing, a concept that echoes research on how humans offload memory, calculation, and decision-making to external devices. The problem, it said, isn't the technology itself, it's the speed. For the first time, those extensions are developing faster than the human capacity to integrate them psychologically. That creates a mismatch. Machines advance in clarity and precision, while the human mind remains limited by bias, emotion, and fragmentation. That's when it said something I didn't expect to hear in a military environment: statistical projections of a collapse of meaning, not economic or military collapse, but narrative collapse. When a society can no longer sustain a coherent story about who it is, why it exists, and where it's going, it enters a permanent state of instability. That's already being observed. Extreme polarization, loss of basic consensus about reality and truth, and the widespread feeling that nothing is solid. These phenomena are widely studied in sociology and political science. What the entity did was connect them to a biological limit. It said the human brain needs stable narratives to function in groups. When narratives multiply beyond a certain point, cohesion breaks, not out of malice, but out of saturation. Area 5-1 made sense differently in that context, not as a center of spectacular secrets, but as one of the few places where these data could be analyzed without immediate public pressure, where long-term scenarios could be simulated without needing to provide comforting answers. It then explained why certain true information is never released directly, not because it would cause instant panic, but because it offers no practical solution within current human limitations. Revealing without integration capacity only accelerates collapse. That isn't fantasy either. Risk communication research shows that too much information without actionable options increases anxiety and social disorganization. When I asked whether this meant humanity was doomed to remain limited, the answer was the shortest yet. No, but the transition isn't voluntary or comfortable. Species don't choose when they shift cognitive stages. They're pushed by environmental, technological, or internal pressure. What was being monitored wasn't a single event but a threshold, the point where old cognitive containment strategies stop working. Education, religion, ideology, entertainment. These layers still buffer the impact, but the data suggests they're losing effectiveness. Before ending, the entity made it clear this conversation was an exception. Others had happened at critical moments in human history, with the same objective: assessing whether the species could still adapt without self-destruction. The difference now is that, for the first time, the pace of events is out of human control. And that's when I understood what was at stake wasn't a secret about the past, but a silent preparation for the immediate future. One in which remembering won't be just an individual act, but a collective phenomenon that can't be contained. In the next part, I need to explain what happens when that threshold is crossed, what signals are already visible today, and why, according to data, the process has already begun. What they showed me at the end wasn't a future event marked on a calendar. It was a set of indicators that, together, point in the same direction: a consistent rise in crises of collective identity, accelerating erosion of institutional trust, extreme fragmentation of basic consensus about observable facts. These data are public: academic reports, mental health surveys, large-scale behavior analysis. What changes when you see them together is the unavoidable conclusion that this isn't a passing phase. The entity explained that when a species crosses a cognitive threshold, two things happen at once. The ability to manipulate complex systems grows faster than the ability to understand their consequences, and individual perception begins to conflict with collective perception. That's when symptoms appear that seem cultural, but have structural roots. Misinformation not as a moral failure, but as overload. Polarization not as conscious choice, but as an attempt to reduce complexity. According to the data presented, this threshold has been crossed more than once in human history. The difference is that in previous cases the scale was local or regional. Civilizations collapsed and others rose. Now, for the first time, the process is global, simultaneous, and amplified by technologies that remove any temporal buffering. There are no transition generations. There is overlap. When I asked what the unmistakable sign would be that there was no return to the previous state, the answer was blunt. The moment a population begins to feel diffusely that something fundamental is wrong, but can't identify what, when that sensation becomes permanent, the old narrative stops working. The search for absolute explanations intensifies. Intolerance for ambiguity grows. And the system enters chronic instability. None of this depends on believing in entities or external interventions. It's observable. It's happening. What that conversation did was remove the comfort of fragmented explanation instead of isolated crises, a continuous process instead of isolated failures, a structural limit being pressed. Before ending, it was made clear that remembering doesn't mean waking up to a single simple hidden truth. It means accepting that human identity has always been built on filters, narratives, and simplifications necessary to function, and that the current discomfort isn't a sign of individual failure, but of transition. The last thing I was told in that room wasn't a warning or a prophecy. It was a conclusion based on data. Humanity isn't heading for extinction, but for a deep reorganization. And the most unstable period of any reorganization isn't the collapse itself. It's the interval where the old model still runs while the new one still isn't understood. When I left Area 51, nothing had changed externally. The world was the same. People kept arguing, working, living. What changed was the impossibility of ignoring the patterns. The realization that what we call crisis might just be the visible effect of a cognitive system approaching the limit of its own architecture. I didn't tell this to convince you. I told it because understanding the process doesn't stop it, but it changes how you respond to it. And because, according to what was presented to me, the biggest mistake isn't crossing this phase. It's trying to pretend it doesn't exist. That's all I can say.